welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Legacy Judaica. Their upcoming auction is taking place next Sunday, November 3rd at 1 p.m. That'll be online at Bid Spirit, as well as live at Ashreya in Lakewood, 978 River Avenue, Lakewood, New Jersey, 08701. So I know there aren't many anymore that are live in person in America. So if anyone wants to check out an auction live, just to check out the bidding and see what's going on, you can attend. I'll also say that I do know Yehuda Schwartz personally, the owner of the auction house, and really upstanding person and upstanding auction house. So you can check it out. A really very fine catalog, about 250 items. They have many Sfarim, manuscripts. There's also some Judaica. Just to mention a couple of the items, there's a good number of items starting in the $100 to $200 range. But there's also some fascinating items worth mentioning is Mitpachas Sfarim, which is the first edition, Rabbi Yaakov Emden. That's his critique of Zohar, and this copy was owned by the Altona Klois, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden was from Ahu, Altona Hamburg Wandsbeck, actually from there, which is pretty fascinating. There's a beautiful copy, I actually saw this in person, of Zera Shimshon, the famous Zera Shimshon. Now it's known for the Skula, Shimshon Chaim Nachmani from Italy, tall, new leather binding, the original edition. So there's that on the auction as well. There's a really fascinating item, a Shal Shuvas Noda B'Yehuda, with the Hagoyis, 60 Hagoyis of Reb David Deitch. Reb David Deitch was the Talmud Muvok of the Noda B'Yehuda, he's one of the Shoyl and many of the Chuvas, the Noda B'Yehuda. So this is Madura Kama, Aleph and Beis in one volume. Reb David Deitch, a fascinating discovery with his Hagoyis on the Chuvas. There's also a Rameir Shapiro's Rambam Sefer Avodah and Karbanis says here over 360 glosses. I also saw this in person, actually a very cool item as well. You could see how much Rameir Shapiro really learned this. The Reshiva Chacham Lublin started Daf Yomi, and this is his copy of Rambam, of one of his Rambam. There's some other things as well. There's actually a fascinating, interesting letter of Ramosha Feinstein about biblical criticism, as well as many other letters. And again, it's a really nice catalog. You can probably pick up a copy of the catalog. It has a very nice printed catalog, as well as there's you can check out the things online. So I'll post a link online in the show's notes where you can check that out. And again, it'll be next Sunday at 1 p.m. Just an update on the podcast here as we start. This is now post-Sukkot winter podcast, so it'll be, again, episodes on Sundays, as well as there's going to be some, and I did the mini-series on Rav Kook. I got very good feedback. And so there's going to be some other mini-series. There is a series on the Zohar coming, and that'll be in a few months. I'm not sure exactly when. That was actually recorded and ready. There's also there's planned a series on Abelazar Fleckless, the Shuv Me'ava, a mini-series. And I have one or two or three other ideas for mini-series. If anyone has other ideas, feel free to email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, and any feedback. If you'd like to sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, and thank you to those that do, you can do so. There's a link in the show's notes. You can also email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or WhatsApp me if you're on the WhatsApp chat. And speaking of which, if you would like, and you can subscribe to the WhatsApp chat where I post new Svarim, new books, book deals. Lately, it's been a lot of book deals. There's not a lot of Svarim now. There should be now, after Sukkot, some new stuff coming out. And also, finally, if you can subscribe to the podcast and rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, I appreciate that. And with that, enjoy this episode. This is a fascinating episode, I will just say about the episode, for me to record and prepare. And for those of you not familiar with Sefer Chezyonos, do check it out. There'll be a link in the show's notes to the English one, which is fascinating. And you can get the Hebrew one, but the good Hebrew one is hard to get in America. But regardless, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Dr. Morris Faierstein. And this time, we'll be discussing Sefer Chezyonos of Rav Chaim Vital, which Dr. Faierstein published in a critical edition in Hebrew. That's actually was second. First, he published a translation of it. It was titled Jewish Mystical Autobiographies, Book of Visions and Book of Secrets, with the Book of Visions being Rav Chaim Vital Sefer Chezyonos, and the Book of Secrets being from the Komarno, Yitzchak Isaac Safrin of Komarno, and that's together. It's a much smaller book, and we'll talk about that a little at the end. Really, this is about Chezyonos, Rav Chaim Vital, which is basically a mystical autobiography, mystical diary. We call it Yom Noah Shel Rav Chaim Vital. The Hebrew was published by Yad Yitzchak Ben Tzvi, and so it's basically an autobiography of Rav Chaim Vital, and it's quite a fascinating read and work. So thank you, Dr. Faierstein, for joining me once again.
Thank you. Good to be with you again.
How and why did you get interested in working and researching this. And this is something that, like I said, first you translated it and then you went into the critical.
Right. It looks like I did it backwards.
Yes.
There's a story behind it. I can summarize in 2 words how I got into it, which is by accident. It started as follows. This goes back to the early 1990s, quite a while ago. I was contacted by Moshe Idel. He asked me to translate the Megillat Sarim, the small book by Yitzhak Isaac of Komarno. He told me that he was planning to write a book about Komarno, and he wanted to include this little mystical diary, autobiography, as an appendix to his book. So I did it. I translated the text, sent it to him, and he sent me back a note saying, "Thank you, it's fine. I'll let you know when my book is ready and your text will be included in the book." 2 or 3 years later, I happened to see him again. I forget if it was in Israel or somewhere else. And we were chatting, and I said, "By the way, whatever happened to that Komarno book?" I said, "Oh, I went off and did other things, and I don't know what's going to happen with that." But he says, "But don't worry about the thing you translated. I'll make sure it'll get published somewhere." He was on the editorial board of the famous Paulus Press Classics of Western Spirituality series. So he went to them, showed it to them, and they liked it. But they said, the Komarno thing is a very small text. I think the printed version is maybe 50 pages or so. So he said, "You need something else with it." So he says to me, "Look on your shelves and see if you can find another text that will provide a complement to the Komarno book." So I started looking on my shelves, and by coincidence, I found a book that in those days was quite hard to find, but I'd found it back in the late 1970s, back when the famous Beagle Eisen bookstore was still in the Lower East Side before they moved to Borough Park. And that was the Sefer Chezyonos, the mystical diary autobiography of Chaim Vital. And as soon as I started flipping through a few pages, I realized that there was a connection between the two. And it's very likely that Komarno may have seen parts of Vital's diary, which were published in the early 19th century, not the whole thing, only a part of it. So I proposed this project to Idel, and make a long story short, he proposed it to Paulus Press, and everything, and they gave me the go-ahead, and that's how Jewish mystical autobiographies got published, and that's how these 2 books came together, and why first was the English. So originally, what it was that I had the Ashkoli edition, and we should talk a little bit about we'll talk a little bit about the history of the manuscript, which is interesting, because the Sefer Chezyonos were not published. The complete text was not published until 1954 by the late Aaron Zev Ashkoli. So I used Ashkoli's text as the basis. Now, what happened was, in terms of the English, there are 2 things. First of all, Ashkoli, unfortunately, he was a great scholar. He died in 1948 while he was working on the Sefer Chezyonos. So the text was completed, but the annotations, there's no introduction. One of his friends, Naftali ben Menachem, who also happened to be the publisher of the Komarno text a few years earlier, he was the one who edited it and saw it through the press. So the Ashkoli edition was not complete in the sense, as I was going through the text, I kept finding places where, there was a source note, a footnote missing, etc., etc. So my translation, in a sense, became a hybrid. I had to write a complete introduction to the whole thing, and also the footnotes the reader who looks English will see, if you read the footnotes, there are some footnotes that are marked Ashkoli's footnotes and some footnotes that I added on my own. I didn't want to sort of take away the credit from Ashkoli. And this was published in 1999. About a year later, I was in Jerusalem and I went to see Moshe Dell, say hello. And we were chatting, and I said, I have an idea, if it's possible. The Sefer Chezyonos was out of print for a very long time. And I'll explain in a moment why it was out of print. And I said, it might not be a bad idea to do a new Hebrew edition, either a revised version of Ashkoli or some new Hebrew edition of the text, because it's simply unavailable. So he thought about it for a minute. He says, you're right. Picked up a phone and called somebody and puts down the phone and says to me, tomorrow morning you have an appointment at the Ben Zvi Institute, talk to so-and-so, and that's how that project got launched. One interesting footnote is part of the process. It was a long process, all kinds of decisions to be made. For example, two decisions that had to be made. One was what to call the book. Is it a diary? Is it an autobiography? And we had an hour-long discussion with the whole committee. Some said, yes, you can call it an autobiography. Some said, no, it's really more like a diary. And in the end, they said, we prefer diary. Okay, so that's why it's called diary in Hebrew and autobiography in English. The other important question was what to do in terms of the text. Should I simply take Ashkoli, what I did in English, and just add notes and introduction to Ashkoli, or, as was ultimately decided, go back to the manuscript and start as if afresh and do a completely new edition. And there are several important distinct things that happen as a result of that. One is that the English version has a fifth part, which the Hebrew does not have. And the reason that the Hebrew doesn't have it is the fifth part, when I actually saw the manuscript, it was very clear that the handwriting was like 17th century Italian, completely different from the original manuscript. So I went back to Ben Zvi, and, again, the committee sat down and they decided, no, leave it out because it's really not Vital. The other interesting thing to know about the Sefer Chezyonos, which is important, is that there is only one manuscript in existence of it. And this manuscript has been verified as being in Vital's own handwriting by the great experts in Israel. Who there are many samples of Vital's handwriting, so it's a well-known, well-documented handwriting, and it's been verified that it's absolutely his handwriting. So, because some people later on claim that maybe it's not authentic, it's a forgery, absolutely not. The other interesting thing relates to the question of the manuscript and where it is.
So I want to jump in, and I want to leave that for a minute. And it's interesting you talk about the forgery. We'll get to all that. And the name Sefer Chezyonos, I think the name itself comes from the Chida, right?
Correct.
I think it's
correct.
The
original has no title.
Right. The Chida gives it that name. There's a lot of credibility to the manuscript and the work. I want to take a step back. There's a lot, and there's actually, it's not just like I enjoy hearing about any manuscript, but for those that don't, there's actually a story here with the forgery and whether the manuscript was lost and sold and whatever. There's a lot going on. But before that, I think we should talk about Rav Chaim Vital and the book.
Yes.
We'll circle back to that.
Yes.
So, Rav Chaim Vital, Calabrese, he was Italian, and let's talk about him. His bio, and obviously we know facts from this book, but his bio, when he was born, where he was from, his rebbeim, his talmidim, etc., his rabbinic positions. We should give an overview of his life. You can mention something from Chezyonos before we dive into the work of Chezyonos itself and what he talks about there.
Okay, so yes, his full name was Chaim Vital Calabrese, and he himself, though, was born already in Svat. But his father or grandfather, some ancestor, came from Calabria in Italy. And Vital, of course, people don't realize that's not his last name. Vital is simply the translation into Italian of Chaim. So he was born in 1542 in Svat, died in 1620 in Damascus. He grew up in Svat. In terms of who his teachers were, one has to assume was the usual suspects. We know he studied Kabbalah with Moshe Cordovero. He doesn't talk too much about his teachers in Talmud and Halacha, etc. But living in Sfat, of course, he had access to some of the great giants. For all we know, he could have studied with Caro. He could have studied with some of the other great rabbis. He doesn't mention them. He had a very high opinion of himself, even had messianic aspirations, as he sometimes mentions. And one of the things that's interesting is that when Isaac Luria comes to Tzvat, he does not immediately become his disciple. It's a very interesting story. Isaac Luria comes to Tzvat somewhere in the spring of 1570. At that point, the leading Kabbalist is Moshe Cordovero. And Luria is sort of, I guess, maybe sitting in on some of Cordovero's lectures. He's really not a public figure yet. Luria becomes a public figure when Cordovero dies. Cordovero dies on the 20th of Tammuz in 1570. And just before he dies, his students come to him, probably died of some sort of plague or something like that. His students come to him and say, who will be your replacement? How will we know who is the one who is worthy to be your replacement? And he says, when I die and you take me out to the cemetery, the person who will see the flame over my grave, that will be the sign that he is the one who is the worthy one to replace me. And the story goes, they go out to the cemetery, they start digging a grave, and suddenly Luria jumps up and says, no, that's the wrong place. It's over there. He points to a different spot, at which point everyone says, aha, this is the person who will now replace Cordovero. And that's when Luria becomes sort of the key public figure in Tzvat. Just one interesting aside in Luria people don't realize. Luria's public career in Tzvat lasted exactly 2 years and 2 weeks. Because on the 5th of Av of 1572, Luria himself dies at the age of 38. Now, Vital writes in his Chezyonos, he sort of considers himself an important person and is not quite ready to say that Luria is his master and teacher. And it takes a good part of a year. It's only the following Nisan, about 9 months later, in 1571, when Vital finally accepts the fact that Luria is his teacher and becomes his disciple. But to give you an idea of Luria, of Vital's self-esteem, shall we say, he writes in the Chezyonos claiming that Luria told him that the only reason that Luria came to Tzvat was to teach Vital. That was his whole mission. And Vital becomes his closest, most important disciple, and the one who basically writes down and preserves virtually all of Luria's teaching. Luria wrote very little, and almost everything that we call Lurianic writings or Lurianic Kabbalah, 90% of it is from the pen of Vital. After Luria's death, Vital tries to assert himself as the one true disciple of Luria's, and we have a document that was preserved that survived. It's called in Hebrew Shtarhut Kashrut, a sort of a contract, where Luria Vital insists that all of Luria's disciples sign this letter saying that they accept Vital as the one true official interpreter of Luria's teachings, and that they will give all their personal notes and manuscripts and writings that they had about Luria's teaching, give them to him so he can organize it into a proper, correct version of Luria's teachings. And it turns out, as we discovered in later years, scholars discovered that, in fact, different students of Luria had very different versions of his teachings. Ibn Tabul and some of the others, Moshe Yonah. So it's very interesting. The other interesting thing about Vital, he did not want to show his writings to anybody else. You could come to his house on Shabbos, and he would orally give a lecture. But you couldn't, if you could remember it and copy it down later, but you could not see the actual text. So there's a famous story about that one time Vital becomes very sick, and the richest Jew in Sfat, a fellow by the name of Yoshua bin Nun, member of a very famous family in that period, who was the richest Jew in Sfat, bribed Vital's brother. Vital was like in a coma, you might say, for a few days, and bribed his brother, and he gathered as many scribes as he could to transcribe as much as he could of the writings while Vital was unconscious. So that's how some of that leaked out. So to get back to the contract, it became very clear very quickly that Vital was not a charismatic figure, could not command the respect of his colleagues and students. And this, by the way, is an interesting motif that we find in the Chezyonos. When people have dreams about him or things in his life, where one of the things that he's constantly complaining about throughout his life is what I like to call the Rodney Dangerfield syndrome. He's constantly complaining that he doesn't get any respect. And he has a hard time making a living. He was never a rabbi of a community or a synagogue, as far as we know. There are huge gaps in his life. We don't know exactly. We know that he left Sfat. Sfat went in the 1580s, 90s. There was a big earthquake, damaged a lot of the city, and that was sort of the end of the glory period of Sfat, economically and also intellectually, and a lot of people left. And we know that in the 1590s, Vital was in Jerusalem, living in Jerusalem. And the way we know about this is that there's a document that has been preserved about a lawsuit by Vital against the rabbis of the community. There was a provision in the tax laws that if you're a recognized rabbi in the community, you were exempt from taxes, income taxes, whatever other taxes. This was a special privilege for those who were recognized as great scholars or rabbis. And Vital had a big fight with the people in Jerusalem because they didn't want to give him this exemption. And that an article has been published about this text. So we know he's in Jerusalem for a while. He next shows up in Damascus, where he spends probably the last 15 years or so of his life. Exactly how he made a living, what he did, is unclear. He talks about on a few occasions about he was invited to give lectures to one famous incident. There's the famous Eliyahu Hanavi synagogue in Jubair, which is the place where the Keter was held, and was in those days was outside of Damascus, and then later on it became part of the city. In fact, there's a story several years ago when the synagogue was destroyed by the Syrians. But it was almost like a pilgrimage place And Vital has in one place a story how he was invited to give like the Mishmarot, the sort of the, I guess, Elul lectures or something you might say. And he was very proud of this because it was considered a great honor. And I guess it didn't happen that often. Another interesting example of how he saw himself or thought he was seen by others is a dream. Not by himself, by somebody else. He has a whole section on dreams that other people had about him. How he knew about them, I can't tell you. I don't know. Maybe he asked, they told him. Anyway, this dream is very interesting, very telling. The dream is that he is the rabbi of a synagogue, and the people of the synagogue are not happy with him and want to get rid of him as their rabbi. And in the dream, a delegation of great rabbis from Tzvat, who are all dead, show up at the synagogue. And they get up and berate the congregants because they're not treating Vital properly as they should. They're not honoring him. They're doing terrible things to him. And they threaten the congregants that if they don't treat him properly, there's a barrel of pitch, of tar, outside the shul. And they're going to have him thrown into this barrel of hot tar. And the person who had this dream is the wife of the shamus of this shul. And according to the story, when she wakes up in the morning, on her finger, she has a little bit of tar. This is typical of sort of Vital's sort of mindset in terms of his situation, how he feels he's being treated by the community around him. We also know that he was married, had 3 wives, don't know consecutively or how, a number of children. Probably the most important of his children was his youngest son, Shmuel Vital, who lived at least until the 1660s and was the editor of one of the major versions. Vital's writings were edited and re-edited in a number of different versions, but the most common version is called Shmona Sharim, the 8 Gates. And this version was edited by Vital's son, Shmuel Vital, who, among other things, there's a story about him exercising a dibuk in 1666 in Damascus. So, and the last thing that we have in his diary is an entry about 1612. That's the last dated entry. And then we know he dies in 1620 at the age of 77.
Right. Now, a couple of things. I think, I don't know, you mentioned his Rebbeim. I think Ramesh Alshech, he mentions, I think, talks about, he mentioned whoever else was there. Also,
yeah, they're all there, but he doesn't mention them by name.
Right. Also, in Damascus, he talks about the Sicilian community. I mean, he's obviously part of an Italian community. He is Italian.
Yes.
He's not Sephardi.
Is Sicily, yes. That's all.
He's not Sephardi. He's Italian. So he talks about he's involved in the Italian community there. Let me
just add one interesting thing about that. Tzvat is interesting how multicultural it was. The Jews in Tzvat were organized by their community of origin. The Ashkenazim, Sephardim meant from Spain, Italians, Mustarabim, which meant native Jews of Eretz Yisrael. I saw in a book that I think Jacob Barnai wrote, or somebody else, about tax records in Tzvat during this period. And the Jewish community had about 10 different kehilot based on country of origin. They were German Jews. The whole Jewish world, in a sense, was represented.
It's fascinating also because everyone thinks of as all lumped together.
Yes, you think they're all Sephardim, it's not true.
And it's
very multicultural.
Right, and especially we're talking about Kabbalah, that Arizal was Ashkenazi, and then you talk
Yes.
about Rav Chaim Vital being Italian. So they weren't Sephardim. The two main, the Arizal and his main Talmud were not Sephardim. It's just interesting. It's an
Yeah.
interesting thing. There's a lot of Sephardim. Obviously, you had, Rabbis of Cairo, and you had all the other ones
Yes.
that were Sephardi there. So,
There were. Probably as far as them, I think, were among probably the single largest group. But all kinds of other groups were also represented.
absolutely. I think that's
By the
important.
way, interesting thing about the Aryan Ashkenazi that I found in the Shara Kavanot, Vital says that he once looked at the Ari's Machzer on Rosh Hashanah, and guess what nusach it was? Nusach Ashkenaz.
Yeah, there's a famous thing. I think, but didn't he say something about the whole year? Maybe he didn't daven Ashkenaz?
Huh?
What did he daven the rest of the year? Did he talk about the rest of the year or just about Yom Neraim?
Probably no, because the Ari actually said that he was not. This whole thing about Nusach Ari is a much later thing because he basically said that there's a notion that one of the reasons why that the Shvatim, there were 12 windows in heaven for each Shevet. In the same way, each community had its own Nusach HaTfilah. So that each Nusach, whether it was Ashkenaz, Sfar, they're all equal, and you should do what you're basically just like with tefillin. If your custom of your family is that you're Ashkenazi, you put on tefillin as Ashkenaz. If you're Sephardi, you do Sfard. Whatever that
Right.
there's no greater virtue in one over the other. At least that's what the Ari said.
So now back to Chezyonos. So Chezyonos
Yes.
is a very interesting book because, as you said, the first part, I don't know if you mentioned this, but I'll just mention this. The first part is kind of a autobiography, stories throughout his life.
Yeah.
The second part is Rav Chaim Vital's dreams. And the third part is dreams other people had on him. And then the fourth part is just assorted different things.
Well, the theme of the fourth part, there is a central core to it. It's about the soul and the notion of Gilgul. But the key part of it is where the Ari tells Vital the source of his soul, who he comes from, and it's very interesting. The Ari tells him that his original soul was Vital de Tolosa, the Maggid Mishnah, which is why he also has the same name. And it's a very interesting explanation of the concept of Gilgul. So he explains, for example, using the illustration of the Maggid Mishnah, he says the Maggid Mishnah was a great tzaddik, so why should he have to have a Gilgul? So the answer is the greater the soul, even the smallest sin could be enough to trigger a Gilgul. So he describes how the Maggid Mishnah once was asked a question about a Nida, the Paskin on a Nida, whether she was Tahar or not. And he got it wrong. And that was a sin. For that, he had to go through several Gilgulim, various people, which Vital describes, some important people, some non-important people, but in every case, there was an issue somehow relating to blood. And when it comes to Vital, the Ari tells him, you were once faced, halachically, with exactly the same thing that the Maggid Mishnah was, and you could have repaired the Gilgul for all time, but you also made the same mistake. And then it goes on to expand on this notion of Gilgul Neshamot and explain, give examples and etc. But that's sort of the fourth part has to do with the notion of Gilgul and the notion of Neshamot. But of course, it was only the Ari who could look at one of the unique abilities of the Ari is you could look at a person, look at their forehead, and know who they were a Gilgul of. Now, there is a section called Shar Gilgulim, which gives you, the Ari described a lot of the historic figures. That so-and-so is a Gilgul of this biblical figure, and this one was of that, etc., etc. That's not in the Chezyonos, that's a whole part of the Lurianic writings. But in the Chezyonos, this fourth part is sort of a chunk of it has to do with Vital himself and his own Gilgulim, and then also about some of the other disciples and explaining the concept more broadly. And those are the four parts.
Yeah. So the first part is I'm not gonna say the most interesting, but that's probably
Selected events. It's
yeah.
not a diary where he writes every day. Just you might say selected highlights.
So there's some really interesting things in here. I think some are interesting, some are
Yeah.
shocking, some are because just to read a sample, and you'll talk more about this, where he mentions
Yeah.
that you mentioned why that Rizal coming to Sfas, he's going to teach him just to read it, and he goes at one point. I mean, he's going to woman. I don't know if it's Jewish or not. Re'isi isha bekia betipas Hashem alamayim. He's reading oil readers. V'amrli nevhalti ma'oid mimasher re'isi b'Hashem azeki asid ata limlech al kol Yisrael b'lishum safek. And he talks more and more about it.
Yeah.
He talks about Shnas Lamed in Ois Vav. There's Oisius. Hayisa Isha Chachma Umedaberes Hasidus V'gam Oisi Bekia B'Chachma Stipas Hashemen. And he talks about who she was, and then he talks about he goes to Muslim magicians.
Yes,
and he goes
that's
to
a very
others,
interesting aspect.
which is very
Yeah.
shocking
So
when you read it.
what this oil thing is a form of divination of seeking the future, and it's very interesting that Vital, and this probably surprised a lot of people. Vital went to all kinds of people. He was always constantly trying to figure out who he was, what was his destiny, what was his future, and all these people that he went to, men, women, Jews, non-Jews. He was always searching for signs, proof that he was as great or as important as he thought himself to be. For example, there's one example where he goes to a Muslim sheikh of some kind, a Muslim sorcerer, magician, somebody who could foretell the future. And he goes in, and the sheikh has like a servant, like a doorkeeper, or whatever you want to call him. And he comes in, and he says to him, I want to see the great man. I have a question for him. And he goes back and tells the boss, and suddenly he comes running back, and the boss says, he tells me you're such a great man, you should come in immediately. He wants to see you because he knows that he's seen in his divination and his whatever that you're a great man, you destined for great things, and he wants to, and he honors him, and this is a non-Jew. But there are also Jews who, there are a number of women who he claims have visions and are seers of various kinds who can see the future, etc. And he doesn't discriminate. He goes to anybody who can tell him something, who confirm that he is a great man, that he's destined for great things. He goes to a whole bunch of people and he tells us what they told him, what they the positive things that they told him, which in a sense, helps him keep his ego up, you might say.
Right, not in a negative. I mean, that's kind of what he's again, this is right his diary, and I think something we should point out, he's writing this for himself, is that you make this very clear, and it's very clear from the Sefer, and this is clear. You talk about this in the introduction, that he wrote this for one person only, himself. This wasn't written as a book to be published; it was written for himself, and this is his diary.
Very absolutely, even his Lurianic writings, he put in his will that when he died, the writings should be buried with him. But they didn't listen to him. He was so private, you might say, in a sense, that he didn't want to share anything with any, and certainly not as a. But he was, there are certain people that are called, it's a fancy English name for graphomane, that they're constantly writing everything. If you think about the amount that Vital wrote in his lifetime, it's volumes and volumes and volumes. He's constantly writing everything.
Yeah,
it was natural that he would write down to remind himself of his, the highlights of his life, of his great accomplishments.
Yeah, we have stuff on Shas from him that's over in manuscript and it's printed in various places. We have things on Chumash, Nigla.
All kinds. There are books on magic, on all kinds of ththings you wouldn't expect.
Astronomy just was printed recently in a Tuchona.
Yes, there's a thing on astronomy. There's a book recently was published called Sefer Pu'ulot, which Pu'ulot in terms of magic, amulets and healing and, all kinds. Just he wrote a whole library on his own.
Now, we have to talk about the most famous of the. I guess it's the most famous, but regardless, it's the one of the highlights of the work, which is the daughter of Rafal Anaf. But what's going on over there? Is this a
and I'll add something that you'll find shocking.
Yeah,
I'll make it even more shocking than you think. So let me set the scene. So this happens in 1609 in Damascus. By the way, I should mention one thing before we talk about it. It's very interesting. We talk about the daughter of Raphael Anav. Even though this young woman, I guess a girl, young lady, we know exactly how old she was. She was certainly pre-marriage age. And she was the center of this whole adventure, yet we never learn her name. Is always referred to as the daughter of Raphael Anav. So the story goes like this. Vital is living in Damascus, and Raphael Anav is just a family name, goes to the fish market and wants to buy a nice big fish for Shabbos. And he beats out several other people who wanted to buy it, and he brings the fish home. And for some reason, Friday night, the daughter is given the head, which is a little odd because usually the head of the household would be given the head. Turns out in the head, there is a spirit, the soul of a rabbi called Jacob Piso, as we learn later on, who has been sent from heaven with a message to Vital. And then a whole long thing ensues. I'll try to summarize as best I can. This piece then inhabits the body of the girl, becomes like a magid. The difference between a magid and a dibuk is more or less the same of a soul inhabiting the body of a person, but a magid is for a positive purpose. A dibuk is a negative one. So, for example, the most famous magid, of course, is the magid of Karo, of Joseph Karo, who had the magid of the Mishnah. So, in a similar way, this Chacham Piso becomes a magid through which, and the daughter of Raphael Anaf becomes a sort of medium, and he speaks through her. And basically, what he's come down to bring a message to Chaim Vital from his teacher. And there's a it's a very long story. Vital doesn't want to come. Piso threatens him with this and that, and in the end, eventually, Vital is convinced to come. And Piso's message to Vital it's a message from the Ari. And the Ari says to him, you've been negligent in your doing your yichudim, your spiritual exercise, etc., and you're wondering why I haven't come to you in your dreams for the last 3 years. And the answer is because of this. So this is time for you to sort of get your act together, and to put it in modern vernacular. And then other things happen, but comes and goes. It's about a 20-page thing, so it's a little hard to summarize. But I just want to summarize one aspect of it that is not known, that I only recently published a few years ago. One of the things that bothered me about in this episode is when the Ari says to Vital, I didn't come to you because of a certain incident. And and the secret is Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha. And Vital still doesn't get it. And then he explains to him, because of this incident where you disobeyed me, you went to a certain place between here and Meiron, and you were attacked by this spirit, and you were in a coma, and you almost died, and I had to save you, which is also a story by itself right afterwards in the same section. And it's all connected to that. Now, what I recently discovered about that is something quite fascinating, and probably most people will find very shocking. Who was this Dibuk, this spirit, that attacked Vital so strongly? In fact, in the story, it says that the Ari had to literally, the famous story of Elisha, when the boy dies, he lies on him and breathes. The Ari had to do that to revive Vital. So I asked myself, what spirit, what Dibuk, could be so powerful to overcome such a great Kabbalist? And I came up with a crazy answer, but I have a proof. And the answer is Jesus. How is that possible? So the secret is this, or the proof. In Shar HaGilgulim, the book on the Gilgulim, I think it's chapter 36, if I remember correctly, there is a section where the Ari, people may know, a lot of the graves around between Sfat and Meron, that whole area, the famous, some of them, like the Talmudic rabbis, go back to, are very ancient. But there's also many other graves that, particularly people mentioned in the Zohar. My favorite being Rav Hamnuna Saba, who's a figure mentioned in the Zohar, but he's not a real person, but yet you can visit his grave. Ari pointed out his grave. And one of the graves that the Ari pointed out was that of the grave of Yeshua Notzri. And when you triangulate where this incident happened, that Vital was attacked, and where the Ari said the grave of Yeshua Notzri was, they line up. I published an article in Kabbalah on it. So that's my theory about this particular episode with Vital being attacked by a spirit, because a Dibuk can only be a Jewish male. Can't be a non-Jew. It's an interesting theory. I published it several years ago, and nobody's written an article saying you're a big Amoritz, you don't know what you're talking about. So who knows? But it's a very interesting, very bizarre incident.
And just getting back to the story of the daughter, again, the unnamed daughter of Rafal Nav, also very interesting, because back and forth, they're going back and forth.
It's a long, it takes a period. He comes and he goes up to heaven, he comes back again. It's a very long and involved episode. It's not just a one-shot affair.
And it's very much back and forth. He said, the messenger said, everybody's talking back and forth. But then there's a lot of other things here as well that are worth. This is also, of course, if we're doing Chezyonos, anyone who's familiar with Chezyonos, we'd be remiss if we mentioned this is where the censored passage comes in. So just to stop and pause for a second, we're going to talk about the manuscript shortly. We're not there yet. I don't want to, but there was the Eshkoli edition, then your English, then when you printed your Hebrew, Machon Shuvi Nafshi, Rav Mansour printed one as well. That one is now in print as well, and as far as and there also, by the way, talking about the manuscript, they have the picture, and he says it's Rav Chaim Vital's handwriting, etc., etc. But he did censor it out because there are parts. I think Professor Mark Shapiro talks about this in Changing the Immutable in his book. There are parts here where the Ruach, this Chacham Piso, talks through the daughter of Falanav, mentions names of various, really Gedolim who did bad things. And then Chaim Vital goes on and just adds fuel to the fire, talking about them. So there are some real shocking things going on here in Chezyonos.
Probably the single most shocking one, I would think, is what he says about Israel Najara.
That would be the one. Israel Najara,
that was probably
the great
denigrates for example, Yaakov Abulafi, who was the rabbi of Damascus. He didn't get along with Vital, and he denigrates him. But Najara is probably the most shocking thing, the most surprising one, where he says he was a great poet, but he was also a great drunkard, and he was licentious, and he was involved in. When he got drunk, he would have sex with even homosexually, and one story he claims that he got drunk on Tisha B'Av and had sex with somebody on Tisha B'Av, no less. So that's one of those things where some people might ask the question: could this be true or not?
And you left it in the Hebrew, you left it in the English. I don't have it in front of me, the Shuvi Nashi edition definitely took out the whole comments or who it's about for sure, but this is part of the story.
In the other edition, the disparaging remarks are, that three dots, like there's something missing.
Yeah, they did leave it in to tell you that they took something out. Correct. They left in the dot.
They left some things out, but I'll tell you something very funny about that edition. You could take a look at. Like when he says very bad things about Yaakov Najjar and also Yaakov Abulafia. If you go to the index, they'll have Yaakov Abulafia, and it'll list the page numbers where the deleted passages are. So it'll talk about somebody terrible things about this person, but the name won't be there. But the index will tell you that the guy talked about on this page is Yaakov Abulafia or Najara. Very poor job of censorship.
It's really wild. I mean, he talks about that he says you're not allowed to read this Pizmonim, but we know what Ari said about Rishon Lajar and his poetry, and it's quite a shocking thing. I mean, there's other things. Again, this is from the most shocking things in the
probably the single most. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that is. But
other than also, some people might be surprised about the idea of going to, Muslim necromancers and women who,
Yeah, there's really a lot.
Magic and.
Yeah, there's that, and then also there's I don't know if we talk about so then there's the Ruach Dibuk thing as well, right? In here.
Yes, in fact, the several episodes. As a matter of fact, the concept of the Dibuk. The first place it happens is in Tzvat. There is no Dibuk story before Tzvat. And the first source is the Sefer Chezyonos. Now, the Sefer Chezyonos was not published till 1954, but in 1629, Yosef Shlomo Del Medico wrote a book, Talmud Chachma, which is an anthology of various things. And in there, he has 3 letters by a fellow called Shlomo Dresnitz, who was a Jew from Moravia, who got so wrapped up around 1600. He hears about the Ari and Lurianic Kabbalah, and he gets so excited about it that he divorces his wife and moves to Tzvat and spends the rest of his life in Tzvat. And he sent a series of letters to a friend of his, who was also an interesting person, Yisachar Ber of Kremnitz, who was a known author of several interesting books. And in these letters, he tells Yisachar Ber about what he's heard about the Ari and the adventures in Tzvat. And this is the first, really what we call Shivchei Ari, all the hagiographic stories by Isaac Luria are ultimately based on these 3 letters that are published there. There was another letter that was discovered in the 20th century, but those 3 letters are the core of Lurianic hagiography. At the end of the 3rd letter, there is a long story about a woman possessed by a dibuk and all the details. In the Sefer Chezyonos, it's very interesting. Vital mentions it, and it's clearly talking about the same incident, but Vital sort of skips over it in 2 sentences. And again, it's very typical of Vital. He says, the Ari, this woman was possessed, her family came to the Ari, said, you got to help her. And the Ari says, I'm rather busy right now, I'll send my disciple Vital. And the Ari explains to him what to do in terms of the incantations, whatever. And Vital shows up, and the first thing that when he walks in the room, the dibuk, or the woman, the Dibuk controls the woman, turns his face away from the woman, turns away face from Vital towards the wall. And Vital gets very angry, runs over and slaps him in the face, or the woman, the Dibuk, however you want to put it, and says, "Why'd you turn away from me? You're not showing me derech eretz. You're not showing me respect." And Dibuk says, "You have to understand, there's this great light of the Shekhinah behind you, and it was so bright that I could simply not tolerate it." And then basically Vital says, "Oh, okay." And then basically, and then I did the exorcism, and that was it. That's the whole story in the Sefer Chezyonos, where in Shlomo Dresden's letter, at the end of the third letter, he's got this long thing, goes on for several pages in great detail. And there are several other instances where Vital exercises a dibuk, but again, always very like 1, 2, 3. Just like, there was a dibuk, I took care of it, without any great ceremony, any great this discussion. But that is the original source of the concept.
Another thing that we should mention, and you touched on this before. Another thing that we're talking about, the interesting things about Chezyonos. This is not as shocking, but it's interesting. Is the messianism that Rav Chaim Vital is talking about? There's a lot of messianism here in the Sefer.
Yes, Vital clearly had messianic aspirations. In fact, he writes in 1 or 2 places that the Ari was Mashiach ben Yosef, and that's why he died young. So if Mashiach ben Yosef has come, who's going to be Mashiach ben David? And Vital alludes that, and the first part of his Chezyonos, there are, that's one of the reasons why he goes to all these seers and visionaries to sort of get confirmation of these things. And some of them tell him, yes, you're going to be a great person, you're going to have messianic potential, etc., etc. Yeah, so he clearly had these messianic aspirations.
And then we already mentioned. So then the second part is, then he has a second and third part, which is dreams that
he has.
And he says, it's interesting. I forgot many, but this is what I remember.
One interesting group of dreams that's worth mentioning. Apparently, Vital and Caro did not get along. Because there's just one that jumps to my mind immediately. There's one dream where Adam Harishon comes to him, and he's sick, and he asks Vital to heal him. And he says, "Why didn't you go to Caro?" The great says, "Caro can't help me. You're greater than Caro." There's also another interesting story where about a dead man who refuses to die or comes back to life, and they wanted. And the reason he came back to life was because when they buried him, they didn't tear off one of the tzitzis of his talus. They didn't make his talus puzzle. And Caro tries to do that and can't succeed. And then Vital goes and does it, and Vital does succeed. And there are several examples of that, where, and then also he goes up to heaven, and he's told by God that God says, "Sit at my right hand." And he says, "But wasn't that supposed to be the place for the great Caro?" And God says, No. I thought about it, and you're greater than he is. So you're more worthy of it than he is. It's a whole series of stories that sort of, in his dreams, he is greater than Caro, which is also interesting.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of things. There's just personal things. He has one. I say so they had a fight, a falling out. Should I take her? But the point is, there's personal things. There's other various personal things he talks about.
It's very intimate in many ways. Clearly, it was not meant for it to be a public document. It was for his own. I guess, recollection, his own. For whatever reason, people write personal diaries, personal. It wasn't meant to be published. Certainly not.
Yeah, I mean, he has, and you talk about he has stories to other people, and then the first dream,
Yeah.
he has, you said maybe other people told him, and we know the first one for sure. He says, "Yerushalayim boy like goy echad b'nai v'amar li chalamti bezu halayla shemikoisel abayis hazeh she'at the dorba from your house, the wall hayoytze ma'ayin mayim chayim. There's going to be a spring umashke l'choil olam. It's going to have give to drink the whole world. Afilu l'goyim." He tells him.
The guy comes to tell him that, not even a Jew.
Yeah, and he has other ones.
It shows you that even the goyim recognizes greatness.
Yeah, he has countless stories like this, and there's some really, really interesting ones. And you already mentioned things in the fourth part. So there's some.
The fourth part is more sort of the soul and mystical things, but
it's a really fascinating, eye-opening, work. But let's talk about the manuscript. So. Yeah. As you said, this is his handwriting. Shuvinashi says in there, you say it, everybody says that it clearly is his handwriting. We know the Chidah talks about it again, the Chezyonos, parts of it were printed. But what's the story of the manuscript? You can talk about that original printing.
The manuscript has a very interesting story.
And the manuscript of what happened, yeah.
So, there is only one manuscript, and as we said, it's in his own handwriting. The earliest that we know of is in the Chidah and Chaim Yosef David Azulai, in the Shem HaGedolim, is a bibliographical work. He mentions Sefer Chezyonos, and he, by the way, is the one who gives it the name Chezyonos. The manuscript itself does not have a title. The name comes from Azulai. Azulai sees it somewhere in Italy, somewhere in the 18th century. In 1826, Moshe Vital, who was either the grandson of Shmuel Vital or the great-grandson, I forget, publishes a small booklet called Shifchei Chaim Vital. In imitation, Shifchei Ha'ari is first publishes a book in 1794, and then 1814 Shifchei HaBesht is published, and then in 1826 a small book called Shifchei Chaim Vital is published. And the Shifchei Chaim Vital only contains selections from the first two parts, not complete, but selections. So obviously, whoever published that and was a member of the family probably had access to the manuscript and took out some selected passages. The next stage in the story of the manuscript is in World War II. Ashkoli is a very interesting person. He was born in Poland in 1900 in Lodz, had a traditional yeshiva education, became modern, got a doctorate in the Sorbonne, and then came to Israel. 1943 comes along, and he was more or less secular. And the Jewish Brigade is created in Eretz Yisrael. And David Ben-Gurion is very nervous. A military brigade needs a chaplain. That's what I did for a career in the U.S. Air Force. So Ben-Gurion does not want some chnyuk, some frumi, to be the rabbi for the Jewish brigade. But they have to have a rabbi. So he has a bright idea. He calls up Ashkoli and says, listen, you have smicha. We'll make you the rabbi. So Ashkoli becomes the rabbi, the chaplain for the Jewish brigade, which fights in Italy. Somewhere around the end of the war, he winds up in Turin and meets Rabbi Toaf, who's the rabbi of Turin. This is the father of the Rabbi Toaf, who was the chief rabbi of Italy, and the grandfather of Ariel Toaf, who's a professor in Bar Ilan. And Rabbi Toaf has a very nice library, and among the things in his library is a Sefer Chezyonos, the manuscript. Ashkoli convinces Rabbi Toaf to let him make a copy of it, a photocopy, which he then takes with him, comes back to Israel, and starts working on it. and then dies in 1948 of a heart attack at the age of 48. And then his friend Naftali ben Nachum publishes what he found. The original manuscript is an interesting story. Nobody knows where it is today. When I started working on it, I was told that Rabbi Toaf owned it. So I wrote a letter to Rabbi Toaf, the one who was the chief rabbi of Italy. And I said, I've been told that you're the owner of the manuscript. I'd like to get permission and maybe a copy. And he writes me back and he says, I don't have the manuscript. I gave the manuscript to Bar Ilan University with my father, the rest of my father's library. I go to them, they say, we don't know what he's talking about. The rumor, shall we say, is that he probably sold the manuscript. You can imagine it'd be a very valuable thing, to a rare book dealer. And one or two names, most of the rare book dealers in the really high end are Hasidim. And there was one in particular who rumors that he may have had it, and he came to an untimely end. And there are other issues. So the end of the story is that after 1945, after Ashkoli saw the manuscript, copied it, what happened to it after it, we don't know for sure. But right around the time, shortly before I got involved with editing the new edition, Yosef Avivi, who was a well-known scholar in Jerusalem, who wrote this major work called Kabbalat Ari, everything, 1,500 pages, 3 volumes, everything you've ever wanted to know about Lurianic writings, was looking around the library of Mosana Rav Kook, who had been the publisher of Ashkoli's edition, and he saw a card catalog, something about what the card said on the information on the card. Somehow something was quite not right about him, but yet intriguing. So he says, I want to see this item. And lo and behold, it turns out to be the photocopy that Ashkoli used of the original manuscript. And so when I came to Ben Zvi and we talked about the manuscript, how to do it, they said the best thing to do is we will try to get the photocopy from Mosana Rav Kook and do a new edition from scratch, which is ultimately what I wound up doing, so that I can say that my text is based not only on Ashkoli's text, but also a comparison with the actual photocopy of the original manuscript. And there was one major difference, which the reader, if a reader looks at both of my editions, the English and the Hebrew, they will notice that in English there is a 5th part, the 5th chapter, which is missing in the Hebrew. The reason for that being that when I actually saw the photocopy, it became obvious that the 5th part was not by Vital, it was by somebody else, probably written somewhere in the 17th century in Italy, and not really connected to the Chezyonos. And when I consulted with Ben Zvi, again, the committee that was overseeing the whole thing, they decided that we should just simply leave that section out. And that's why it's still in the English when I did not see the original, but after seeing the original, that got deleted.
So, as for the accusations of forgery,
yeah,
this is something Reuven Margolius level. Where do these come from? Yeah, what's his basis for that?
Yeah, okay. So this goes back to shortly after 1954, shortly after it was published, the Ashkoli edition. So Reuven Margolius, famous scholar who did the Zohar and many other things, and the brother of the Ger Rebbe. Margolis was a Ger Chassid. They read Ashkoli's edition, which does not censor anything, and they were scandalized by some of the passages. And they said, this cannot be true. There's a similar, a parallel to this with Karo's Magid Meshorim, that after Karo's Magid Meshorim was published, there are people, and there's a long tradition of people saying that cannot be authentic because he's a raving mystic and many other things. And the great author, the great rationalist author of the Shulchan Aruch and the Beis Yosef and all those other things could not be the same person who wrote these crazy things in the Magid Meshorim. Because they're basically, what they're doing is they're retrojecting their own sensibilities, their own worldview onto somebody who lived several hundred years earlier. So the same thing happened in this case. And the result was that Margolius and company put pressure on Mossad Rav Kook that within a few months of its publication, whatever copies had not been sent out for distribution or had not been sold, basically were withdrawn from circulation. And the Ashkoli edition became a very rare book, only obtainable in major libraries, almost impossible to find in bookstores. By some miracle, back in the late 70s, happened to be at the famous Beagle Eisen bookstore when it was still in the Lower East Side, and they were selling more secular books than they sold in Borough Park, and had used books, and I just happened to come across it. And not quite sure what it was, but I was trying to build up my library. I was still a graduate student, and basically was buying anything that looked interesting that I might have a use for someday. So I bought it, and it sat there on my shelf for probably almost 15 years until Moshe Dell asked me to find a book to match up with the Komarno book.
By the way, just if I could say, first of all, Beagle Eisen is still the best farm store here, and second of all, give a plug for Beagle Eisen. Also, that's still, my advice as a farm collector is still the same thing. If you find something interesting, buy it. Especially, I remember a friend of mine told me a couple of years ago something interesting came out. Actually, by the way, speaking of which, it was a new edition of Rabbi Yisrael Najara's Kli Machzik Bracha. I remember still what it was. Someone printed a new edition with some other, some later on Kabbalist, I think it was, I forget where, as far as they put in the back, like Sefer Chezyonos. It was a small work. And Kli Machzik Bracha is a very interesting sefer where he talks about Birchas Hamazon and what the nice, it talks about Birchas Hamazon and benching and you should have Kavanah, whatever. It's a very nice sefer. And I remember my friend had a copy. It was in this farm store in Lakewood Shtega Plaza, and he said, "Listen, buy this because whatever this item is never going to be around again. This is somebody printed this, a nice edition with some notes. Yeah. Forget about it."
Yes.
So that's always the rule. If you see something interesting, pick it up and buy it because it probably won't be around. The classics, while they're very important, usually they're most important, but they're going to be around. You don't have to worry so much about that. If you're looking for something,
no, the standard books will be around, but these odd things, particularly religious svarim. Somebody comes along and prints up an edition of 500 copies, whatever, and he makes his money, and then that's the end of it.
Yeah. So again, that was the kind of going back to the accusation against it. But as you've pointed out, and as others pointed out, and the Chidah talks about. I mean, it clearly is Rav Chaim Vital, and we know it's his Ksav Yad Kotcher. We know it's his own handwriting, etc. So let's just to finish up and to mention the Komarno. I mean, really that's a separate thing, but because you put it in the English, so anybody. By the way, in the show's notes, I'll put a link to the Hebrew and English. The Hebrew, again, I'll just mention the Shuvi Nafshi censored edition. If you want to have the novelty of that, it was reprinted recently and it's available in local farm stores. I believe they probably put it by the Kabbalah section, even though it's not really a Kabbalah sefer. I mean, there's things in there, but not per se.
Not to sing my own praises too much, but I think that any reader will find that if you compare the notes and the sources and the introduction, I think there's a lot more historical material and sources and things like that than you'll find in the Frum edition.
I just mentioned, yeah, I just mentioned that one because
Yeah.
that's the one that's readily available. Also, because the Ben Zvi one not as easy to get, so I'll just mention it for the Ben Zvi. I'll put a link on Ben Zvi's website if you get it from there. You can always ask Eliezer Brut. He's always able to get things from Eretz
Yes.
Yisrael from, or if you're in Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah.
And I will link to the English one, which is available on Amazon. I'll link that to the English
Yes.
one. Now,
Readily available. You can buy a used copy also.
yeah, I got it for a few dollars. It was not expensive.
Yeah. It's still in print,
$20.
by the way. It's
Yes.
interesting. Paulus Press pays royalties. One of the few academic publishers that does. And even though it was published in 1999, every year I still get like $20, $30 in royalties. So it's still in print. It's still
Better than
being sold.
$0.
So I'm amazed. What can I say?
So I'll link to that as well. But let's finish up because you do put the Komarno in. So just in brief, we're not going to go into the whole episode on Komarno. Komarno is a fascinating subject with fascinating farm. Then we can spend hours on Komarno. Just
a very important person that really needs more study.
Yes, so I don't want to go down.
He's a major league Kabbalist.
Yes, and he has other Svarim and Nigla. I don't want to go down a whole rabbit hole of Komarno. I just want, but because it's in the book and anyone buying can be like, what's going on?
Yes.
Just in brief to mention Komarno and the same.
Megillat Starim. It was published also modern. It was first published by Naftali ben Menachem in the same series as the Sefer Chezyonos, by the same series of Mosar Rav Kook in 1944 from two manuscripts. So it was not available till 1944 in print. It has two parts. The first part is Komarno talking about his life, an autobiographical sketch. And the second part is, it's very interesting, he starts having dreams when he's 40 years old. And so the second part he records his dreams. And it's much smaller. It's only about, I think, 30, 40 pages. The first part, is his father died when he was a child, so he was raised by others. And so he's also one, by the way, Komarno shares with Vital. It's also being somebody who's a very prolific author. Like Vital wrote a tremendous amount. So maybe that's also part of why he had this urge to write down. Maybe for Komarno, maybe he did it for his children. He doesn't say why he did it. May have done it for himself, for his children, but it was not, as I say, it was not published until the 1940s, so it was not well known. But there are similarities, one can say, in terms of the personality. He also has these messianic aspirations like Vital. There are a lot of interesting parallels between the two of them.
So that's something you included here as well. So I think just to finish off, this is a very fascinating work. It's there's some shocking things in here as well throughout, as we've discussed here. So why should somebody today pick up Chezyonos and read it in English or Hebrew, as you mentioned, the differences between, why should someone pick up and read it? What do you think?
Well, I'm so wrapped up in it that it's hard for me to say. But I think in some sense, one of the valuable lessons, I think, is it's interesting to see, I think, to me at least, it's very interesting to see that, the world has changed. That the idea, if you go tell a frum Jew today that some great rabbi went to non-Jews or to women or the idea that like Reuven Margolis says that a Kaddish V'Tahar, Chaim Vital could not do these things. It's impossible because he's a frum Jew. He's a Makobel. He's a Talmud of the Ari. We have this sort of. I mean, I'm old enough to know. So I was born right after World War II. I still knew people from before the war, and there was this. In some ways, they were very different. It was more of a, like one of the things I always like to tell people when I was a kid in the yeshiva, the rebbeim and the Rosh Yeshivas. They were people you couldn't imagine today a Rosh Hashiva telling you a joke, and certainly not even a slightly off-color joke. Is a simple example of how sort of the perception of people and sort of the world is. But when I was a kid, the Rebbeim, telling a joke was you were disappointed if they didn't have a good joke every once in a while. So to me, it's a window into a different world, or a world that maybe is not the way we think it was.
I think I'd agree with that. I think it's also not only the way you didn't think it was, it's something, it opens your eyes to what things were and how different they are, than not even only how different they are from today, but how different of what we conceive, what we think they were like. We imagine Chaim Vital and that Tkufa. And I think that
they were flesh and blood people. They were not sort of these cardboard figures.
And I think it's also the irony is that the negative comments in here is what gets like the airtime, and it's what you hear talked about when people talk about Chezyonos, and like you read them and they are shocking, right? But the really shocking comments, the ones that are really eye-opening, are the ones where he's talking about, and the ones that are not censored, by the way, in the Shuvi Nafshi edition, combine any Svarim store where he's going to read the oil and his this and his that, and they're going to the magicians, and it's like the Muslim magicians. You're like, what? That stuff is all in there in the classic edition that you can find in the store, and that's the stuff that's really more shocking. Negative comments are negative comments, but that stuff is just really mind-blowing for somebody today to read.
Yeah, because you wouldn't imagine, Chaim Vital is this thing. He's not a real physical person.
Hey, we're talking about Rav Chaim Vital. I mean, the greatest Mikubalim, the Talmud Muvak of the Arizal. We have so many writings, as you say, from him.
Yes, exactly.
And that's what we're talking about here. So it's really, it's different. I think just in general, autobiographies and these type of things are very important for people to read. Talk about the Chidas Magal Toiv, the letters of Rav Bar Tanura from Eretz. So these type of things people should read. It's fascinating to read.
Yes, they're very important because you see the reality, not the sort of, the Disney. I like to call it the Disneyland version as opposed to the real version.
And by the way, that goes for, just by the way, hagiographic, quote unquote, yeshivish history, or even academic history. It goes for both. You read the primary sources and read what they're saying.
Absolutely.
People like, you talk about Maked Meisharim. There's plenty of things to read. Great, literature available to read, and that's quite fascinating. So I think this is one that really is like that. So I'll include, again, the link in the show's notes to your English edition, which is the most easy. Just click on it in person on Amazon. Your Hebrew edition, which is Ben Tzvi, or like I mentioned, email Eliezer Brat, he's great. Or the Shuvi Nafshi one. It should be available in Svarim stores. And thank you very much, Dr. Faierstein, for joining me once again.